I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Amira Simha-Alpern, who I'm sure everyone knows, is a clinical psychologist and certified psychoanalyst and clinical supervisor. She is director of the postgraduate programs in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy at the Dora School for Psychology at Adelphi University, as well as a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Stony Brook University. She maintains a private practice in Smithtown, New York. Amira?
Hi, everyone. It's good not to be at the director's position. I'm a rider, a passenger, not a, which is great. By the way, before I start, I want to say to John and Ron, and we are happy that you're part of our family. So it looks like there's reciprocity in the sense of family. So I'll talk a little bit about my chapter. My chapter is about a failure in my analytic work as a psychoanalyst. Only one way to understand a failure or a mistakes from the perspective of a therapeutic engagement is that it's a misrecognition of the patient's subjective state. We often refer to it as misattunement. So failures, mistakes, blunders, enactments are sexy words now in the relational perspective on the therapeutic engagement. They're almost idealized, romanticized. Enactments are considered the royal road to the unconscious. There's almost a sense that if they don't happen naturally, you have to invent them in order to deepen the therapeutic engagement and the authenticity of the endeavor. Of course, this is inspired by Winnicott, Cohort, and infant research by Ed Tronick, Beatrice Bibi. I don't want to be academic. And the work of the Safran and Moran and the relational perspective on the therapeutic process is that it's actually a series of mistakes or ruptures in the therapist attunement followed by repairs. So we know that the best of us, only 30% of the time are attuned to our patients, and the therapeutic action is conceptualized as the repair of the ruptures, and the growth and transformations are facilitated by the analyst optimal mistakes. But in the chapter, I describe my work with the patient, and I read a failure, not a temporary failure, not a sexy failure, not a glorified failure. My recognition of the patient's subjective state, and the nature of our therapeutic engagement came too late, and only through a dream I had in which she was included, and in which I share in the chapter. In my dream, just briefly, I'll say that she rejects my invitation to get respite from the cold and join me in a warm, cozy bed covered with down comforters. So there's a longing that is not reciprocated by the patient. By that time, she was already on her way out of therapy. After a year and a half of 3 times a week psychoanalysis, she terminated therapy via email. So I said that I was broken up with a text, and declined my invitation to explore what happened. No reflection, which is at the heart of our analytic work, or repair were possible. Now, I entitled my chapter Dora and the Bathwater, and of course it's after Freud's famous case of Dora. This famous case has been mentioned frequently throughout my education as a psychologist, but for some reason it was never assigned as reading, even not in my analytic training. So I read the case independently, relatively late in my training, and I was astonished to discover that it's actually a failed case. Dora left therapy abruptly after 11 sessions, and Freud complained that she didn't take his advice. He actually understood that it's a failure. He saw her in 1900, and it was not published until 1905. In between, he tried to publish it, and he was rejected from publication. So we should all feel okay about being rejected from publication. The stated reason was that he didn't protect her confidentiality, but I think the material was too volatile for conservative society. So there is a considerable shame, embarrassment, and humiliation among professionals to share real failures. If we do, we tend to glorify it and couch it within this, our grandiose capacity for self-criticism. Can you imagine what would have happened if Freud would have archived the case or throw it away altogether because it was a failed one? We know that the Dora case inspired his work on the interpretation of dreams and taught all of us who treat survivors of childhood molestation what not to do. I'm a clinical writer. I don't write theoretical or research papers. My writing is exclusively about cases that did not go smoothly, cases that challenged me, surprised me, didn't quite fit into a frame of a ready-made psychoanalytic formulation. Writing about a patient or a therapeutic engagement helps me understand the patient better. I always say, and I say to my students, that we learn from our teachers, supervisors, therapists, students, our own, and our peers, but we learn a great deal from our patients as well. So what did I learn? I learned from this patient. One thing I learned was the centrality of the shame in shaping who we become, how we cope with shame, tolerate or not tolerate shame, defend against shame, sublimate a sense of shame. The classical theory perceives our development as a guilt-based unfolding drama, but later theories give more credence to the role of shame in our development. The second thing that I learned from this patient is that the self is an amalgamation of multiple self-states and not an overarching one sense of core self. This was my first training case, by the way, during my analytic training. I did it in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Bromberg's famous paper on standing inner spaces was published in 1996. At the time of my analytic training, and I have some of my classmates are right here with me, so they can share that too. But at that time, the idea of multiple self-states was still controversial. Working with the patient convinced me that the mind consists of multiple self-states that are often in different levels of organization. After all, she was high functioning in many areas, but her love relationships were very disorganized. A sense of rejection, see my dream that I long for her and I'm rejected? Just remember that when I say that. So her sense of rejection from a love object launched her into a very disorganized, needy state that was in stark contrast to the self that was negotiating the professional and academic aspects of her life. When rejected, she became obsessed with the loved object and found herself doing things that later she felt ashamed of. So when we talk about engaging the self, this is the title of the book, we probably ought to talk about engaging the selves in plural. Each self-state needs to be engaged in a slightly different manner. This, of course, is an idea that was developed by Jody Davis, not mine. I just was convinced by that patient that this is a viable idea. The third thing that I learned from her is the importance of play, even in adult psychotherapy. This is not, I don't have time to develop it. I'll be happy to answer questions about this idea, but this is not a new idea. It was already introduced by Ferenczi in his famous paper on the elasticity of psychoanalytic technique in 1928. I just did not read the paper by that time. I should have. And the fourth and last thing that I learned from the patient, and again, I don't have time to elaborate on, is the importance of paying attention to the therapist's dreams about their patients. So that's for now. And if anybody wants to hear more about one of these points, I'll be happy to share it later.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amira.